You've heard about Roe versus Wade. It allows for abortion throughout the United States. It overturned the laws of all 50 states. But what were those laws? Why were they there? We'll find out that and more on this edition of Life Matters.
The sanctity of human life is under assault. Find out how and what you can do about it in this edition of Life Matters with Brian Johnston, Western Regional Director of the National Right to Life Committee.
Hi, I'm Brian Johnston, and I'm your host of Life Matters, the program where we explore life, culture, and the battle of ideas. And this battle really is on. It's happening all around us. If you're not ready for it, the ideas that the television, the radio, the newspapers, and in some cases, maybe your friends and neighbors are repeating into your ear ideas that are not actually based in fact. You know, in the right to life, we base our position in objective facts. That's right, self-evident truths. That's the basis of our nation, and it's the proclamation that the founders made that they would base the laws of this nation in. So in talking about the abortion issue, let's look for a bit at where abortion laws came from before Roe versus Wade. English common law. And under English common law, there were two different penalties on abortion because of the lack of understanding under common law of when life really began. It was clear that if there was movement in the womb, somebody was alive, moving, kicking, whatever it was, this was a living human being. And under common law, it was considered a felony to kill a child after quickening. Before that, they didn't really know. Science at that time under common law was not well developed. They were doing their best, but before that time, they weren't sure. In fact, there were so many theories. Some of them are humorous. Before quickening, it was actually considered a scientific theory that, well, maybe there's a little man that lives inside the sperm, and then when he meets the woman's egg in the womb, he goes to live in the womb. And they called this little man homunculus. And I kid you not, this was actually a scientific theory because they were guessing. And go ahead and wiki that. Look that up, homunculus. And he was considered this little guy. Well, that's not scientific fact. That was a wild guess. But they did know that there was a child moving in the womb at quickening. So that's why they had the distinction in the law. This changed during the Industrial Revolution with the invention of many devices. Probably the most powerful at that time was the modern microscope, and they actually witnessed mammalian conception. And what happened is that the British decided, and by the way, the British were really ahead of the game in many ways when it came to civil rights. You may not know that, but they banished slavery well before we did. And if you haven't seen it, I recommend a great film called Amazing Grace. It's about the parliamentary debates and efforts to bring an end to the slave trade in the UK. And it's very, very powerful. Again, I can't recommend that highly enough. And it's really very much related to our issue. Is this a human life? And why would we discard human lives if we know this is a human life? Well, what happened in 1869, because of the knowledge that had been developed about life in the womb, there was a law passed by Parliament called the Offenses Against the Persons Act of 1869, and that made all abortions felonious. And this is very important because it was recognized this is a human life that you're intentionally killing. By the way, it was not women that were punished, it was abortionists. One of the assertions of Planned Parenthood and pro-abortion advocates is that women are punished and were punished. That's not the case. That has never been the goal of the pro-life movement. And before Roe versus Wade, women were not punished. A study of over 200 years of legal history by the American Center for Bioethics concluded there's no evidence found to support the proposition that women were prosecuted for undergoing or soliciting abortions. There were no documented instances of prosecution of such women for murder or for any other species of homicide. Nor is there evidence that states that had provisions enabling them to prosecute women for procuring abortions ever applied those laws. The vast majority of the courts were reluctant to implicate women because, in a secondary fashion, they are the other victim of abortion. It was the abortionists themselves. They're the ones that were prosecuted, and they're the ones that need to be held accountable after Roe, because abortion is obviously an inherently dangerous act, specifically for the child, but also for the woman. So I recommend that you look that up. Let me give you the citation. Women and Abortion, Prospects of Criminal Charges. And that was written by the American Center for Bioethics in the spring of 1983. And you can find that in our show notes. But the origins of these laws are based way back in scientific knowledge about human life and caring for human life under the law. And that's the purpose of the law, is to protect lives. So we inherited our law from English common law. It's important to recognize that the British, using common law and using science, ensured that the child in the womb would be protected under the law. I think it's also significant that the British were well ahead of the Americans in ending slavery, and they wanted to stand up for human lives that were being thrown out. This is very significant because protection for children, vulnerable children in the womb, came shortly after protection for slaves who had been simply discarded. It's not accidental that in both cases science was the predicate, observable facts about human lives that can't be debated. These are observable, demonstrable facts. A young man at the University of Edinburgh at that time was actually from Massachusetts, a doctor, and this had a great impression on him, and we're going to talk about him, Dr. Horatio R, in just a moment.
You're listening to Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Well, hi. I just wanted to thank you for joining me. You know, I have good friends, children, young adults, and adults that have Down syndrome. And they are so loved. Their parents love them so much because they're the happiest people you'd ever want to know. I really love them. I'm going to tell you something, though, that's rather frightening. The government of France has now prohibited showing positive images of Down syndrome children and letting parents know how lovable they are. That's an actual law in France. Here in the U.S., 80-some-odd% of Down syndrome kids are killed by abortion before they're born. In France, it's 96%. So we're not a whole lot better. If you'd like to help out, you can go to the National Down Syndrome Society, ndss.org, to help out. That's ndss.org. We really are in a battle of ideas, and lives really are at stake.
And now back to more Life Matters with Brian Johnston.
Hi, welcome to Life Matters. I'm your host, Brian Johnston. Life Matters deals with the right to life, with culture, and with the battle of ideas. Today, we're going to talk about a very important idea and a true fact from history that most people don't even know. We do know this, that in 1973, the Supreme Court of the United States proclaimed it didn't know when life begins. Now, that is a scientific fact, and it was very well known in 73. Nevertheless, the court said we don't know when life begins, and because the states have laws against abortion, we're going to disregard those laws. And on the basis of a woman's right to choose, the child in the womb can be disposed of at any time. It then created the trimester system. The court created the trimester system. You may not know that. And said that abortions in the various trimesters should take place in various facilities. In the late term, they had to happen in a hospital-type facility. But in earlier terms, literally, they could happen in freestanding clinics, which didn't exist at that time. Clinics that were determined to be established for abortion itself. So Roe versus Wade and Justice Blackmun, by a sweep of his pen, created the abortion clinic system we see in America, and he struck down the laws of all 50 states, which up to that time had protected children. Every state had laws regarding abortion. Some states, a handful, California, Colorado, New York, Massachusetts, had more liberal laws. That is to say, they still prohibited abortions in most cases, but allowed them in others. Typically, for example, the model in California was after 20 weeks, you could not kill that child. Before 20 weeks, you could if you had a pretty good reason. And you've heard that standard reason. It's a litany you'll hear used a lot. What about rape? What about incest? What about the life of the mother? What about severe fetal deformity? That standard litany was actually used in California, and you had to have one of those reasons before 20 weeks gestation. Every state had laws saying that is a human being and should be protected. Roe versus Wade struck down all of those laws. You have to understand something important. Those laws were put in place by the act of one citizen activist, one lobbyist, if you will, who took it upon himself to get other people concerned about what he knew to be facts. Who was this person? I would call him the founder of the pro-life movement. That's Dr. Horatio R. Storer. Dr. Horatio Storer lived in the 1850s, and he began his crusade against abortion as a doctor from Massachusetts. He had been trained in medicine at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, because that was one of the preeminent medical schools of its time. Dr. Storer realized something in his studies. He focused on childbirth in his studies. And when he came back to the U.S., he continued on, and he was the founder of what we call today the specialty of gynecology. He found that in pursuing childbirth, it was very clear to him that he had two patients, two very unique patients. Now, you may not know this, but up until the 1850s, abortion was practiced in certain parts of America, and somewhat routinely and yes, dangerously for both the child and the mother. And just as the liberalized abortion laws after Roe v. Wade, there was the idea that at a certain point, and it's called quickening, at a certain point after quickening, oh boy, we probably shouldn't be killing this kid. Quickening is the moment that the movement can be felt in the womb. And again, that's arbitrary, but that means about that time, we know that kid's alive. Before that, they weren't quite sure. And therefore, they allowed abortions. And Horatio R. Storer realized something. I want to put this into context and what was going on in the 1850s. When we come back, I'm going to talk about the legal significance of what Dr. Storer did to protect unborn children, how it's directly tied to slavery, and the legal significance of protecting slaves and freeing slaves under the law that Dr. Storer, once he saw the 13th Amendment pass, and that the right to protection under the law was given to someone who had not been protected, he worked personally and got the American Medical Association to work to restore legal protection for those that couldn't protect themselves in the womb, the unborn child. We'll be back in just a minute, and you'll be fascinated by how he did this, because it's an example of what you and I need to do to protect those that can't protect themselves.
Life Matters continues after this.
Well, hi. I just wanted to thank you for joining me. You know, I have good friends, children, young adults, and adults that have Down syndrome. And they are so loved. Their parents love them so much because they're the happiest people you'd ever want to know. I really love them. I'm going to tell you something, though, that's rather frightening. The government of France has now prohibited showing positive images of Down syndrome children and letting parents know how lovable they are. That's an actual law in France. Here in the U.S., 80-some-odd% of Down syndrome kids are killed by abortion before they're born. In France, it's 96%. So we're not a whole lot better. If you'd like to help out, you can go to the National Down Syndrome Society, ndss.org, to help out. That's ndss.org. We really are in a battle of ideas, and lives really are at stake.
And now back to more about life, culture, and the battle of ideas with Brian Johnston.
Welcome back to Life Matters, where we talk about life, culture, and the battle of ideas. Today we're talking about Dr. Horatio R. Storer, truly a significant individual in American history and for the battle for life. Storer lived an interesting time in history. Think about it. He was born in 1830. He died in 1922. Now, at that time of his birth, the issue of slavery was racking the nation, and it wasn't to be resolved until 1865, as you know. But the idea that there could be a human being who was considered less than a human being under the law was something that was in front of the American people. And it was addressed by the 13th Amendment in 1865. The law needed to address the humanity of what had been considered mere slaves. Dr. Storer was dealing with a very similar issue. You see, Dr. Horatio R. Storer, he was a Boston physician. He was educated in Edinburgh, the finest medical school of its time. Dr. Storer came home to Massachusetts, continued his practice, and it became obvious to him that there was something wrong in American medical practice. Some states had laws regarding abortion. Those laws said that after quickening, you shouldn't kill the child in the womb. Quickening was a very crude scientific observation that there was a human life inside the womb because it could be felt. The child kicked. That's typically what we assume in the first dramatic action. If you know anyone who's been pregnant, if you've been pregnant, the kicking of the child is a pretty clear indication somebody's alive in there. But Horatio R. Storer, as a scientist, knew much more, that the child was alive before that. You see, in 1836, science had already revealed the beginning of life. And in 1973, when Justice Blackmun issued the Roe v. Wade decision, which struck down the laws of all 50 states, he, just in passing, said, "We don't know when life begins." Well, that's what polite people would call a lie. It is known when life begins. A man by the name of Thomas Berry, and he was knighted for this, he witnessed mammalian conception in rabbits, and he wrote a monograph. That monograph, it literally shook the scientific world at the time because there was no debate. It was an objective fact that life begins at conception. And you know that in the Right to Life, we deal with objective facts, with self-evident truths. The right to life is based on self-evident truths, that all of us human beings are created equal and endowed with rights, not by the government, but by our Creator. So we know when life began. We've known since 1836. When our hero, Horatio Storer, went to medical school, he was learning even more about the child in the womb, such that he came back and said that we have to address my second patient. Again, he was the founder of gynecology, but he recognized that his second patient was the child in the womb and that the child was even more vulnerable than the mother, and that child needed legal protection and needed to be recognized as a vulnerable human being. He saw that slaves finally had been protected under the law, and he acted to be sure that children in the womb would be protected under the law. He began his crusade in 1857, and that crusade went throughout the nation. He enlisted the help of the American Medical Association. And at that time, as a member of the AMA, he published many monographs depicting his understanding of medical science and jurisprudence of the law, and how the law was inadequate in the protection of both mother and child. And that at that time, even those states that had laws regarding quickening, those were inadequate because it was clear that scientifically this child was alive and was a human being before quickening. In other words, it isn't just late-term abortion. This is a human being, and the laws are designed to protect human beings. And if we have to right an injustice, as we did with slavery, to say that this is a human being that must be protected, we must do that for the child in the womb. Dr. Storer went state to state because that's where the abortion laws are. And most laws, by the way, do take place state by state. The real significance is this. Dr. Storer did not go and present his faith, his belief, his opinion. He presented objective facts regarding that child in the womb. He presented what he knew to be the scientific evidence of that child and his second patient. He knew that abortion laws were necessary. At that time, he succeeded. By 1860, he had already gotten several states, and by 1868, all of the states at that time passed laws against abortion and criminalizing the act of killing that child in the womb. Those were to stay in effect, and as each state came into the Union, they also adopted laws that protected the child in the womb because of the work of Dr. Horatio R. Storer. It was in 1973 that those laws were struck down. See, that's where the laws came from the use of science, from the use of facts, and by the active civic involvement by a caring individual that demonstrated that this was a human being. His job was not to go and to tell people what his belief was. His job was to go to state legislators and explain the scientific facts and the need to protect that clearly, undisputably human being that was being killed in every abortion. That's an example for us. And here at Life Matters, we want to remind you that you have a job in this battle of ideas. We're going to see Roe versus Wade overturned. But what that's going to do is return once again the right to states to again protect those within their borders. You're going to have to work hard. You're going to have to use facts. You're going to have to be a conscientious, involved citizen who, we've all got other things to do. Dr. Horatio Storer had his practice, but he set that aside in order to correct an injustice. The Right to Life movement is made of people like that. Not just doctors, but people from many backgrounds who realize a great injustice has taken place when we kill human beings that are vulnerable. Because if we don't stop that injustice, greater and greater injustices will come to pass. I want to invite you to read more about Dr. Storer. Go to lifematters.life. You can also see some of the show notes there. And do your research. Make sure you're prepared for the battle of ideas and ready to bring an answer when people ask you why we should care about those who cannot protect themselves.
If you have questions or comments for Life Matters, call 800-924-2490. Give us your name and the town you're calling from and a quick question or comment. Here's a question we received from a listener.
Hi, this is Brenda calling from Elko, Nevada. I don't understand voting on the right to life. I'm uncomfortable voting on a single issue.
Well, thanks, Brenda. That's a great question. We hear that a lot. But you have to think about what's really at stake in voting. You know, we talk about the battle of ideas, and what politics is really, it's about policies. So voting is where you can allow ideas to have the greatest consequence. And all of us do have ideas that we hold dear, or we should. We should think about it. Sometimes people do just vote with their passing emotion. They decide based on what they had for breakfast how they're going to vote, or they like the person's name, or that they had a pretty picture. But real politics and real policy and real voting in a free republic has to do with voting on the basis of ideas and the kind of policies a candidate will put into effect. It's an American tradition. In fact, if you think about it, the American Republic was founded basically by single-issue voters that said they wanted representation. Remember, no taxation without representation was a founding premise of us starting our nation, and it's continued throughout our history. I was once asked by a reporter why we were justifying single-issue voting, because there's just so many issues. And yeah, there are a lot of issues, but all of us have a hierarchy of issues. Some issues are more important than others, and they should be. Again, you need to think about what matters. I asked this reporter, I said, look, what if you had a candidate that you really liked, was well-spoken, was right on all the issues across the board, except for one, just one issue where they disagreed with you? And this particular reporter said, well, I don't think that would matter that much. I said, yeah, but what if the issue was freedom of the press? What if this favored candidate that you really liked was opposed to freedom of the press? As a reporter, you would support that candidate? And he stopped and he said, yeah, I see what you mean. In reality, all of us have a bottom line. And if you don't have a bottom line, you haven't been thinking long enough about it. That's why in the Right to Life movement, we're made of people from across the spectrum, different faith backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds. But really what the Right to Life is a voting bloc are different people who agree that the law should protect innocent human life. Thanks a lot, Brenda. And if you have questions, feel free to call 800-924-2490 and we'll try to answer them.
Learn more about everything in today's show online at lifematters.life, where you'll find all the resources you need to protect life. Subscribe to the Life Matters podcast, where we have even more information on this and all the life issues. Go to lifematters.life to subscribe. Listen to more Life Matters, Saturdays at 1 p.m. right here on K-Bright.